we reach the Reformation,
Mais le temps de la Réformation,
Martin Luther, the father of the Reformation,
le père de la Réformation,
who believed that the key idea was that salvation was by faith alone,
qui croyait que la clé du salut était the key of
faith alone,
la clé de la foi était le salut.
Believed that Mary represented all the works that people do in order to try to get into heaven.
Marie représente ce que les gens font pour...
Non. Martha.
Marthe représente ce que les gens font pour hériter le royaume.
While Mary represented faith in Jesus.
Et Marie représente la foi en Christ.
I'm telling you all this.
Je vous parle de tout cela.
To show you that the same story that you know,
pour vous montrer que la même histoire que vous connaissez,
has been interpreted in quite different ways,
a été interprétée dans beaucoup de différentes façons, de manières,
by different people,
par les différents hommes ou différentes personnes,
in different situations.
Dans différentes situations.
But in many churches in the 20th century,
dans beaucoup d'églises du 20e siècle,
this text has become a site for the battle between men and women.
Et dans beaucoup des églises du 20e siècle, ce texte était devenu un combat entre les femmes et les hommes.
There have been many male preachers.
Il y avait beaucoup des hommes qui prêchaient,
who have used it to tell women,
qui accusaient les femmes,
that if they are going to be good Christian women,
s'ils peuvent être des bonnes chrétiennes,
they have two choices.
Elles ont deux choix.
Work hard like Martha,
travailler dur comme Marthe,
or sit silent like Mary.
Ou s'asseoir comme Marie était à côté de Christ.
And sometimes they say it's better to sit silent like Mary.
Et ils ont dit quelquefois c'était bon de s'asseoir comme Marie.
My understanding is that this regularly annoys women.
Ma compréhension est que ceci était vraiment embêtant, que c'était vraiment une façon d'embêter les femmes.
Because they identify with Martha.
Pour les identifier avec Marthe.
Their lives are filled with busyness.
Leur vie était remplie de business, des affaires.
And concerns.
Étaient concernés
about practical things.
Dans des choses pratiques.
About running the house.
Pour comment conduire les maisons.
About looking after the children.
Comment s'occuper des enfants.
And the idea
et les idées
that they should do all that,
de faire tous les actes,
and also find time to sit and be silent,
et de s'asseoir,
can often feel wildly unrealistic.
Voir ridicule. Irréaliste, merci.
And quite often I understand,
et j'ai souvent compris,
that there are women who get very cross with Jesus,
qu'il y avait une femme qui était vraiment attachée au Seigneur,
because he sides with Mary against Martha.
Une English pastor. On acclame pour les pasteurs. Parce que je crois que c'est tout le monde qui va au collège et qui peut comprendre. Amen. Nous sommes en Angleterre, comprenez.
Am I scaring you away as well? So I want us to go back and start to build a careful look at this story, and then afterwards you can tell me whether you are persuaded by my interpretation or not. Okay? Fair enough. What we're going to do is we're going to back to John Calvin, the father of the Reformed family of churches. And you're in a Reformed church at the moment, yes? John Calvin of Geneva wrote commentaries on most of the New Testament. And in his commentary on Luke's Gospel, he won't have this idea that this story means that it's describing the way to live all your life. He says, the story tells us that Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus. Did she spend her whole life there? This is not the story of how to live your life. This is the story of one particular visit that Jesus made to a house, and how two sisters in that house responded to the arrival of Jesus. And to say that this is how all women everywhere ought to live all their lives is nonsense. Does that make some sort of sense? I think by the time I've heard that, all these theories about this is exactly how people ought to live all the time are blown out of the water. Calvin is saying Mary didn't spend her life sitting at Jesus' feet. She would have starved quite quickly, and Jesus would have got bored and gone off. So that's important. And then another thing I think we need to look at is where the story occurs in Luke's Gospel. It occurs immediately after the story of the lawyer who came to Jesus and asked, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responds not by getting into an argument with him when he says, "But who is my neighbor?" but he tells him a story. The story that we know as the story of the Good Samaritan. You know, the man who helped the other man. And the lawyer had thought that to be a good, faithful follower of God, he ought to have nothing to do with Samaritans. But Jesus' story makes it quite clear that a Samaritan who helps people in need is far better than a Jewish priest who walks on by. And he ends his story, remember, with that wonderful question, which of these three was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by the thieves? And the lawyer has to admit the one who was kind to him. It's interesting, he can't bring himself to say the Samaritan. So he says the one who was kind to him. And you know what Jesus said then? You go and do the same thing. That story is one of the strongest stories in the whole Bible, urging us to offer practical help, care, and service one to another. How could Luke possibly put as the next story a story that was meant to say, don't bother with being careful and helpful and serving, only sit and listen? Yeah? It's a nonsense, isn't it? So whatever we understand the Martha and Mary story to mean, it cannot override the message of the Good Samaritan story, which says, get out there and do what you can to help other people. Incidentally, the Good Samaritan story says that to a man and a lawyer who might have thought that his job as studying the law would entitle him to sit at a rabbi's feet. And Jesus actually tells him to get out there and do something that works. So, that begins to limit the ways that we can understand our story. It can't be about, it is better to sit and listen always and everywhere than it is to get out and do things, because that would reverse what the story before said. Then, more recently, some scholars have been saying, but let's look at how the story works. The people that talk in this story are Jesus and Martha. Martha comes and complains to Jesus, and Jesus responds to her. And Mary is just used as an illustration. This is not the story of two sisters. This is the story of Jesus having a conversation with Martha about what Martha should do. It reminds me of another story that we misread. You know the story we call the story of Cain and Abel. And we tend to read it as being, which of the two brothers did the right thing? If you read the story carefully, the story is about a conversation between God and Cain about how Cain copes with the fact that God has accepted Abel's offering and rejected his. And Abel is just incidental. It works out badly for Abel, but he never says anything. And in fact, he gets killed before he can say anything. And the big debate is between God and Cain. You better watch when you're coping with the injustice of the situation that feels really unfair to you, that you do not let anger and sin destroy you. Yeah, God says to Cain, sin is waiting at the door, ready to get you. And what does Cain do? He gets so cross with God that he can't kill him, so goes out and kills Abel instead. But the issue is that he's then just done the very thing that God warned him against. The story is about the conversation between God and Cain, and Abel is just a part of that story. Similarly, here, if you look at the structure of the story, this is a conversation between Jesus and Martha, and Jesus uses Mary as an illustration of what he's saying to Martha. Are you still with me? Amen. Now, the next thing is that so many interpretations fail to realize is that in Jesus' day, everybody knew that you had a duty of hospitality. If somebody came to your house, it would be a matter of enormous shame if you didn't look after them properly. That's still largely true today, isn't it? If somebody came to visit you and you just left them sitting in the lounge and you went off and did something somewhere else and you didn't bring them anything to drink and you didn't speak to them and you didn't say when you'd be back, they would feel insulted, wouldn't they? They'd say, what's going on here? And it must have been equally true in Martha's day. And it's intriguing that the story says that Jesus entered the house of Martha. It doesn't say he entered the house of Martha and Mary. It's Martha's house, and she's quite unusual in that she is a woman head of house. There is no man in the house that we know of, so she's quite something as Martha, and that means that the responsibility of making sure that her visitor is looked after properly falls on her head. And as she's the woman, she can't turn to her wife and say, you do it. She's got to do it herself. Now, I'm not saying that it's right to turn to your wife and say, you do it. I'm saying that that's what would have happened in a male house in those days. Yeah? So she's fussing because she knows that it will bring shame on her house if she doesn't look after Jesus properly. So everybody knows that when she goes and says, why is my sister leaving me to do all this on my own? Tell her to come and help me. Everybody knows that the right answer for Jesus is to say, I will. Mary, get in the kitchen. Yeah? Don't leave your sister to do all the work. And the story only works if you remember that that is what everybody knows is the right answer. But we know from other places that Jesus regularly fails to give people the right answer. And he fails to do the things that everybody else knows is right. Everybody in Galilee knew that the one thing you must not do is touch a leper. What does Jesus go and do? He touches a leper. And he doesn't just do it by mistake. Oops. He does it because his heart is filled with pity for the man and anger that society is treating him like that. Yeah? And again, if a prominent man in the community comes to you and says, my daughter is dying, you don't stand around in the crowd trying to find a woman that nobody knows who she is, whether she touched you or not, and keep the man waiting. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Do you know the story? Because she isn't important in that society, and the synagogue leader is very important. And so the synagogue leader's concern for his daughter is obviously Everybody knew your first concern. But Jesus doesn't do that, because he's actually trying to show that there are other concerns than the ones that everybody knows are the right ones. That there are other ways of behaving other than the ways that everybody knows are the right way of behaving. So why, oh why, does he say this astonishing thing when Martha says, "Tell my sister to come and help me in the kitchen"? And he doesn't. Why does he do that? He must have had a reason, and he must have had a purpose. And from the way that he talks to Martha, I think it's very clear that he wants her to understand something very important. Look at the way he uses her name twice. He doesn't just say Martha, he says Martha, Martha. That is a signal. If you use somebody's name twice, it's a signal that you may not like what I'm going to say, but I really, really want you to try and hear it because I think it's very important for you because I love you. Yeah? And it sort of says all of that just by saying the name twice. Now, sometimes that could be very patronizing, but Jesus